Hi, this is Misha, and we've already done a video on the Finnish Suomi KP41 submachine gun. Quite a long and probably boring video, but it's such an interesting history. So with that out there, we had to also do one on the Finnish KP44 or M44. And this was never actually called Suomi, at least in Finland. That was kind of a name stuck on in America. But it has its own interesting history. Now this is also often called a reverse engineered PPS-43, which is true and false at the same time. So we're going to talk about these guns here, how they are similar and different, and the history of the KP44. Now first off, just for introduction, this is one of the IO imported Polish-made PPS-43C semi-autos. It fires 7.62 25 Tokarev. It has the original top folding stock pinned in the closed position. We have a 10-inch barrel. It feeds from standard box mags. These are double stack, double feed, which was a good feature. It was originally a full auto only gun, the PPS-43, with the safety here, just a manual lock trigger safety. The whole gun is metal, mostly stamped metal. Really only the barrel and the bolt are machined. And it had Bakelite pistol grips. Of course, originally it was open bolt, as I said. It has a flip rear sight, adjustable post. This is in other videos, but it's worth bringing up here because of how it relates to this. So, when Finland was fighting the Soviet Russians from late 39 through 1944, it captured a large number of its submachine guns. Now, Finland's pistol caliber was 9x19 with kind of 7.65 Parabellum. 30 caliber Luger is a secondary choice. So it wasn't using 7.62 25 Tokarev or even really 7.63 Mauser. Initially during the Winter War, it captured the PPD, both the PPD-34 and the 38. Then beginning with the continuation war, it started to capture the PPS-41. And then starting in the summer of 1943, it started to see the PPS-42, which was essentially the first version of this critter here. And then, of course, by late 43, early 44, it was capturing the original PPS-43. Now, in total, they would capture about 4,000 submachine guns in 7.62 Tokarev from Russia. The majority, about 2,500, were PPS-41s. So the original idea, they thought, well, honestly what soldiers did, they would first use the guns until they ran out of ammo, then they would turn them over to the military, so the military would have these in their depots. The idea was to convert the PPS-41 to fire 9mm. This didn't go well. They couldn't bore out the barrels. They tried that. It didn't work. Then they tried making new barrels. They had some difficulty getting theirs. And then for some reason they tried to make a narrower mag well as opposed to just using the drums. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It didn't work. They tried it. No go. They had a dilemma. I mean, they're fighting a war. Tikkakoski is only delivering so many KP31s. They needed more submachine guns. At this time, they were hoping to have 3 per infantry squad, so a very high number. So they looked at the 4,000 Russian guns they had. It just wasn't a large enough number to warrant switching to using that cartridge. So the next step was to look at the PPS-42 really, and also the 43 as it became available, trying to make them fire 9x19. So the very first kind of prototypes were made in late 43, around October. They took mostly PPS-42s, pulled out the chocolate barrel, put in a 9mm barrel, and tried them out in November of that year. And surprisingly, they did pretty well. They found them to be more accurate than expected, even compared to the KP31. Much lighter, several pounds lighter, much shorter. And so they thought, yeah, why don't we, do this? Why don't we look into actually building our own version based on the PPS? Now, again, the 44 isn't exactly a straight copy. We'll get into why, but there are some differences, actually a large number of them really in the details, although the broad strokes are the same. So two Finnish designers kind of started with the PPS. They were Salo and Kekin, sorry, and they would rework it and come up with a design, but of course they're not having a company, so they don't manufacture it. Both VKT and Seiko were way too busy to take on more projects. And this kind of left it to Tikkakoski again. Now they were still pretty busy with the KP31, but they had more leftover capacity than VKT. There was another company, Amos or Almos, that kind of got in, but they were small. They didn't have the government connections. They really never stood a chance, and from what I've read, their bid on these was way too high. The whole idea with this was to make a cheaper submachine gun compared with the KP31, not something the same or even more money. Now it's also worth pointing out they never really wanted to replace the KP31. They wanted to supplement it. And this is the same situation in Russia. The PPS was never meant to replace the PPS-H, it was just meant to be for special uses. For infantry, just in the battlefield, both the KP31 and PPS-41 are great. But for, say, vehicle drivers, some people on, say, bikes, messengers, special forces, having a smaller, lighter gun was of benefit. It also helped that it was made of stamped steel, so the idea was to make it cheaper and faster to mass produce. Helping Tikkakoski, Sweden was interested in a 9mm version of the PPS, so some deals were struck and some assistance given with tooling and helping getting the whole stamping system down was provided from Sweden. This really gave Tikkakoski the edge, and even before trials, it was essentially already the de facto winner. Now it's worth pointing out that Sweden never adopted or even manufactured anything like the M44. Ultimately, they went to their Gustav M45, which is more akin to a Sten gun than anything else. It's not really based on this at all, but there was some Swedish partnershiping there early on. By the summer of 1944, Tikkakoski had delivered its first test batch of about 36 M44s. These did well. Initially, very early on, the FDF wanted to have 50,000 of these. But this number was quickly slashed by the bean counters to 40,000. It was already slashed again by August when the first order was placed down to 20,000. Now, it's worth pointing out that since Tikkakoski was building both this and the KP31, the cost was pretty commensurate. They ended up basically pricing these at half of what the KP31 cost, but I've read that the idea was if this ever had gone into true full-scale mass production, that would have gone even lower. So this should have been a third to even a quarter of the cost of a KP31. So let's look at this gun before we get into its history. You see in it here, I've got my coffin mag, and I talk about all the mag variations in the KP31 video, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But this mag well is one of the biggest differences with the Russian gun. As you see, it's open-sided, so it can take the Xiaomi mags. As a result, we have more of a enlarged front trunnion here. It's a very different shape. We still have the open-bottomed barrel. We still have the shroud with attached simplified brake. This barrel is just a smidgen shorter. It's about 9.8, 9 3/4 long, so just a little bit shorter than the Tokarev. Sights are pretty well the same, flip aperture. Top folding stock is very similar. Bolt is similar. Now this is hinged a little differently. This lower frame is hinged further back here with a different style of mag catch compared to this guy over here. You see its hinge is further forward on the frame. Actually, it's in front of the mag well. Take its mag out. Because this takes its own double stack mags, it's a little different. Again, these being semi-auto, guys. You see how it's hinged here. Much larger, more open compared with the M44, which has to be further back because of its magazine. See, much smaller lower frame. That's a pretty significant difference, that mag well. But it allowed them to take mags they already had on hand. And of course, the biggest difference being it's in 9mm parabellum, firing the same cartridge as the KP31 as opposed to the Russian round. Now originally, these would be either used with the coffin mag, which was already kind of falling out of favor by 44. So the drum is pretty much the standard again, which is great for capacity, but it adds quite a bit of weight, and it is kind of hard to grip the gun. Where are you going to put your hand? You could put it here, but then you got to worry about the reciprocating charging handle. Can't really hold it by the drum very effectively, and if you hold it up here, you might touch the hot barrel. Yeah, kind of an issue. Another change they made is they went from Bakelite grips to these wood grips here. Still the same basic pattern, but were made of wood as opposed to Bakelite. We're still full auto only on the original military gun. Whereas the Xiaomi was good out to about 300 meters practical with an ultimate range of about 500. This was more of a 200 meter maximum, at least maximum practical. More like 1 to 150 really. So a little shorter range because we do have a shorter barrel. And we don't have semi-auto as an option. But again, the trade-off is we are much shorter and lighter. The Xiaomi was a little under 35 inches without the muzzle brake and a little over 36 inches with the muzzle brake, and the stock was very much fixed. This is a little bit over 32 inches with the stock deployed and 24 inches with the stock folded up. So we are quite a bit shorter. On the other hand, we do have this reciprocating charging handle, whereas the Xiaomi's was not. But on the other hand, this was again much cheaper to produce. And again, I think it really surprised them how accurate it was given what it was. And it did carry over the reliability and durability of the PPS-43. There's just not much to go wrong. It's a very simple, very straightforward weapon. So yeah, the Army ordered 20,000 in August 1944. However, then the continuation war with Russia ended on September 5, so not even a month later. And so the order was cut to 10,000. Now to be fair, originally the order was going to have two batches. The first batch of 10,000 and then a second batch of 10,000. So really what they did, they just canceled the second batch of 10,000. But they would at least have the first batch go into production. Tikkakoski would tool up and they would start to deliver these throughout 1945 and fulfilling the whole contract. Now, as I said in the KP-41 video, after peace with Russia, then Finland was obligated to basically fight the Germans still in Finland. This was known as the Lapland War, and it would last until April of 1945, and these did not see use in that war. They just weren't ready in time, and the soldiers already had enough KP-31s because hostilities had ended with Russia, so they could dedicate all of their forces to that. So by the time these were in the hands of the military, they were basically no longer needed. The need to have a mass-produced submachine gun stamped steel was pretty well gone. They had enough KP-31s for the most part, plus they had 10,000 of these that were in production. This gave the FDF ultimately 60,000 plus submachine guns by the early 50s. It's kind of interesting. The PPS-43 suffered a very similar fate in Russia. The PPS-41 was made in much larger numbers, even though the 43 was faster and cheaper to make, because by the time World War II ended, it too really wasn't needed. So far fewer of these were made than were originally estimated. Even the American grease gun, the M3, suffered this fate. It was adopted to replace the more expensive Thompson, which is very analogous to the KP-31. So these stamped guns that were put into production, while good, were actually made in fewer numbers than their more complicated counterparts. Really, Germany was ahead of the curve on that front with their MP-38 and MP-40. But I digress, sorry. I love history. Anyway. These were pretty much issued with the drums throughout the 40s and 50s until the 36-round Trapezoidal Mag came into service. As I said in video on the Suomi, this was originally a Swedish design, first purchased from Sweden and then produced in Finland by Lapua. And this is the mag for this gun. In every sense, it goes with the whole light motif, keeping the gun easy to handle. It still has a large capacity. It's worth noting that this had a slightly lower cyclic rate than the KP-31, whereas the KP-31 was somewhere between 750 and 800 to 900 rounds, depending on ammo and how it's adjusted. This was more like 650 rounds, maybe 700 per minute. So it was a slower rate of fire. That helped since it was only full auto. And this worked well with this gun. And that was about it. These were used by the Finnish Frontier Guard, who really liked them because they're guard guns. They're not actually using them. They're just carrying them around all day, so they appreciated how much lighter and easier it was than the Suomi to maneuver around with. The only time this was ever really deployed was when Finland sent troops in 1957 to the Suez region as a part of a UN peacekeeping operation with the whole Israel-Arab thing there. So these were deployed there, and that's where you see most pictures of these in the field. And that's it. I mean, I wish there was more to say, but mostly these just sat in storage as reserve weapons, along with these excellent trapezoidal mags. The KP-31 was long out of production, with a small batch being made in 53, just using up leftover parts. So in 56, the FDF did talk about restarting production of the KP-44, getting another 10, 11,000 in their hands, just to supplement to make sure they had enough submachine guns. However, instead what they did the following year, they struck a deal with Interarms, which was a major international arms dealer, not just to civilian guns, but for militaries as well. And they purchased quite a large quantity of Sten Mark II and Mark IIIs, along with magazines for them. And this was really just to supplement and tide over until the assault rifle was coming into the FDF service, which was, the RK-62. Already by 58, 59, they were starting to consider, and by 60, 61, the earliest trials, and the RK was already in full production by 65, pretty much relegating the submachine gun to very much secondary use and reserve use. It was still as a good guard gun, but that was about it. These were still deployed in some small numbers through the 70s. However, considering they had over 50,000 KP31s and only 10,000 of these guys, the chances of getting issued one were pretty small. I did forget to mention a small little batch, a secondary batch that was done around 1951 of these. The Army Depot AV1 did assemble about 400 from just leftover parts. Again, very similar to what they had done with the KP31, but the KP they much more of. So that brought the whole total up to about 10,400 in FDF service. And since these were never really used in anger, very few, if any, were lost through attrition and, destroyed. They just weren't used that much. By the 80s, they were already put up in depots. And by the 90s, along with the KP, they were declared obsolete, and that was it. So really, this one's history has more to do with its development and inspirations than it does its actual use. Nevertheless, a really neat piece of Finnish history. I guess it's only fitting they kind of copied the PPS-43, considering that Russia copied the Suomi drum magazine. So turnabout is fair play. As to semi-autos, these kits came in a few years ago with the barrels still intact. And so a few companies built these. This one is an SMG built by Rick down there in Texas. Also, T&W did a small run a few years ago. And pretty much all of the 10,000, give or take, in Finnish that were made, most of them ended up over here as parts kits. And most of them were in excellent shape, again, because they were never used. But that was pretty much it. Far more Suomi KP31s were made, about 80,000. So it's a 8-to-1 ratio. And it's pretty much a gun that's not really thought of much these days. It's not a bad gun. It was a good gun. It just was kind of too late for its intended purpose and never really needed. Well, that's about all I can say on her. If you haven't checked out our first video, please do so. Also, we have one on the Swedish M45 Gustav and several other submachine guns. Kind of fun little guns to shoot, inexpensive to take to the range and enjoy. I've had this one for a very long time now, nearly 10 years? 9 years, I think, come this December. So yeah, nearly 9 years. I like it. It's a neat gun, kind of interesting, and wasn't too expensive or anything. Goes well with my Suomi. I like Finnish history. It's just very entertaining. Well, anyway, if you have any comments, we'd love to hear them below. And if you like the video, we'd appreciate the like click. And if you'd like to help support us, please click on the link and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.